This is Maldon, one of Victoria's most iconic goldfields, and one of the best places in the state to explore our fascinating gold mining history. Gold was first discovered here in 1853, kicking off a rush that saw thousands of hopeful diggers pour into the gullies in search of fortune. The early alluvial boom was short-lived, but the real success of Maldon was locked within its rich quartz reefs. And this goldfield would go on to become one of the colony's most important mining centres. What really sets Maldon apart isn't just how much gold was found, it's how the gold was won. This is a place where mining companies not only chased fortunes, but also pioneered ideas. The challenges faced by miners here drove the early adoption and advancement of several revolutionary mining technologies and processes. Maldon was home to the very first pneumatic rock drill used in Australia. One of the earliest large-scale cyanide plants, was the birthplace of many innovative improvements in the gold processing industry, and the place where enterprising, forward-thinking men like Robert Oswald and William Gray truly pushed the limits of what was possible in the recovery of gold from quartz. In this video, we're going to take a look at the fascinating gold mining history of Maldon, from the chaotic early days of the rushes to the prosperous height of underground quartz reef mining. This is more than just a story about the old mines of Maldon. It's the story of how a goldfield helped shape the future of Australia's mining industry, an industry that's still going strong here in Maldon today. I'm here at the North British Mine in Maldon, where you'll find some of the best surviving mining machinery foundations in Victoria. The North British was one of Maldon's most successful mines and was solely owned by quartz mining magnate Robert Oswald. This mine was a huge success, producing over 242,000 ounces of gold. But before we get to that, we better start at the beginning. The story of the Maldon Goldfield started in 1853 and was kicked off by the adventurous professional prospector, Captain John Maycosk. He discovered gold at the foot of Mount Tarrangower, and when his find was made public in December 1853, it wasn't long before the area attracted wider attention. A rush quickly set in, and in no time at all there were thousands of diggers flocking to the gullies, where more rich alluvial ground was discovered and worked. By early 1854, there was already a thriving settlement, and a description in the Argus described a narrow road with a knee-height layer of dust, lined on each side with stores of every description: saloons, restaurants, eating houses, lemonade and beer shops, apothecaries' shops, and doctors' tents. The little settlement at the Tarrangower diggings was surveyed that year and named Maldon after a town in England. Those early days weren't easy for the alluvial diggers. A lack of water and a rush at nearby Simpsons Ranges practically deserted Tarrangower, but it was only temporary and work at the young goldfield pushed on. In many areas, gold was trapped within a tough, sticky clay, and in order to retrieve it, the clay needed to be effectively softened and washed away, leaving the gravels and gold behind. In the very early days, this was done exclusively by hand in a puddling tub. You often come across reports in old newspapers that describe diggers getting incredible amounts of gold to the tub. These are the tubs they're referring to. These were often reported in ounces, but now and then a lucky digger would be measuring his tub's yield in pounds. Just imagine that. Horse-powered puddling machines were introduced in the early 1850s, and while the concept was likely based on identical machines which were used to puddle clay in the pottery industry, the application was different. For pottery, the gravels are removed and the clay retained, while for gold processing, the clay is removed and the gravels retained. A circular pit in the ground, lined with wood, was filled with wash dirt and water. A horse circled the machine, dragging a harrow through the mixture, breaking up the clay and turning it into a slurry. The gold and gravels released from the clay would sink to the bottom, and the clay slurry would be discharged from the machine, leaving the clean wash dirt behind. The larger rocks were manually removed, and the heavy residue at the bottom of the machine would then be cleaned up and washed for gold using a cradle or dish. At one point, there were more than 70 of these puddling machines at work on the Tarrengower goldfield. Puddling technology advanced quickly as developments were driven by the needs of large alluvial mines. But the simple horse-powered version of the machine was a mainstay on the goldfields right through the 19th and early 20th centuries, being a relatively cheap and simple way for small parties to efficiently process their wash dirt. One of the first modern alluvial mining associations on the Tarrengower field was the Porcupine Gold Mining and Washing Association, who obtained a lease at Porcupine Flat and constructed a steam-driven puddling machine supplied by Henry Baker of the Talbot Foundry at Castlemaine. This machine was the sort which was used in large alluvial mines, with discharge doors at the bottom of the machine and powered by a 20-horsepower horizontal steam engine. Although this machine was the most modern puddling technology at the time, the venture was short-lived, failing to live up to expectations. Porcupine Flat happens to be the site of another, much larger, much more efficient processing plant. But we'll get to that soon enough. Some very interesting stories have been recorded of the early Maldon goldfield. One digger, who was on a good payable claim, had regular loads of wash dirt carted to a nearby creek. Several times he noticed that the heap looked smaller in the morning than it had the night before. He was convinced someone was skimming the top, so he set a clever trap. As usual, he had a few loads delivered, and just before knocking off, he mixed about a pound of finely chopped mutton fat into the top of the heap. Sure enough, the next morning, the heap appeared to have been skimmed again. Wandering down the creek and chatting cheerfully with fellow diggers along the way, he kept a close eye on their washing. When he reached a well-known shady character emptying a puddling tub, he spotted bits of mutton fat floating out. The thief protested, claiming it was from using tallow candles, but no one was having it. He was apprehended by the police and received justice for his trouble. A gold buyer on the diggings was nicknamed the Nobby Gold Buyer due to his flashy appearance, and one of his particularly striking features was his luxurious and well-oiled head of curly hair, which turned out to be much more than just a fashion statement. When a digger brought fine gold into his office to sell, the Nobby buyer would chat away cheerfully, run his fingers through his oiled hair, then handle the gold, doing this several times before weighing it for the sale. The devious fellow spent his evenings at a basin of water, washing the day's bonus from his fine curly wig. For coarse gold, he had another trick. He'd pick it up in his copper scoop and give it a good shake towards the handle, where a hidden slit would open just enough to sneak out a pennyweight or two. While there were some fantastic yields in those early days, Maldon was never destined to become a great alluvial field like Ballarat or Mount Alexander. The real wealth of Maldon lay locked up in its quartz reefs. The first discovery of auriferous quartz at Maldon was made on January 24, 1854, by Wilson, McNulty and Hurley, who came upon an outcrop partially hiding in a clump of timber. At this time, quartz mining was in its infancy, not just at the newly discovered Maldon goldfield, but all over the colony. There wasn't much serious attention paid to the reefs at Maldon at first, but some were so rich at the surface, children were breaking gold out with hammers, and a Sunday amusement for the diggers was going out collecting specimens for curiosity's sake. But it wasn't long before the true potential of Maldon's quartz reefs was realised, and it was the reefs which would secure the permanency of the Maldon goldfield. The Eaglehawk, Bells and Beehive reefs were discovered in 1854, and while several parties set to work with great enthusiasm, the first methods of extraction and processing were very crude. At first, the quartz was just broken up by hammers, and then hand-powered stamping machines were introduced, which used the springy branch of a tree or a counterweight on a pole to assist in crushing quartz in a dolly. An astonishing amount of gold could be won using these simple machines if the quartz was rich enough, but the gold that was missed could be just as astonishing. To assist with crushing, miners roasted the quartz to make it brittle before breaking it up to smaller size with hammers. At first, quartz was roasted in open heaps, then kilns were constructed for the purpose. Roasting also helped to oxidize some of the pyrites, releasing more gold, a method which endured at Maldon for a long time. It wasn't long at all before small hand-powered versions of Burden mills were introduced. The Burden pan was an American invention which consisted of heavy iron balls in a large pan, which was tilted and rotated. Small pieces of quartz which were placed in the pan were crushed by the rolling balls. The hand-powered versions were quite inefficient, but were certainly a step up from crushing with hammers and dollies alone. The first Chilean mill on the Maldon field was introduced in 1855. These mills consisted of a circular trough in which heavy stone wheels, capped with iron rims, were rolled over quartz to crush it. These somewhat more sophisticated mills quickly began to replace the hand-powered Burden pans, and some owners were crushing for the public at a very profitable rate. Through the mid-1850s, the fabulous German, Nuggety, Victoria, Lyles, Linscott's and Parkins reefs were discovered, along with many others. Miners were sinking onto the reefs with narrow shafts and raising their ore using windlasses. This involved a lot of manual labour, but many reaped rich rewards. As work went on, miners soon formed small syndicates to pool their resources and work more efficiently. As shafts got deeper, horse-powered whims began to replace the man-powered windlass, and more material could be raised from greater depths. Improvements in crushing machinery were also introduced. The stamp mill appeared on the Maldon goldfield at around the same time as the Chilean mill, but the first machines in use were crudely constructed and were powered by hand or horses, making them quite inefficient. But when large steam-powered stamp batteries were brought in, they quickly became the dominant method of crushing and amalgamating all across the goldfields. By 1859, there were over 50 quartz mining claims along the Eagle Hawk line of reef. The quartz at Maldon was incredibly rich. Some claims were so successful that even with inefficient crushing machinery, the great cost of crushing, high losses of gold and difficulties with groundwater, very large fortunes were made in a very short time. Perhaps none so incredible as the astonishing yields of the Nuggety Reef. The Nuggety Reef was accidentally discovered in the mid-1850s by a young fellow named Alexander Pettit, who was out searching for stray horses. Not having any luck, he sat down on a rock to rest and picked up a stone. Gold glittered in the rock, and he and a few others worked the stone on the quiet for 2 months before their discovery was noticed. The reef was rushed by early 1856, and a series of small claims were pegged out. The gold in the stone at Nuggety Reef was said to have glistened like a jeweller's shop, and the biggest success story of those early days was David Crystal's claim, which he worked to a depth of 280 feet for 1,395 kilograms of gold. Crystal made an absolute fortune on the Nuggety Reef and erected a large crushing works in town, introducing the first steam-powered machine on the Maldon goldfield. Within a few years, there were several small companies formed on the Nuggety Reef, which mined from a number of deeper shafts. In 1863, the Tarrangower Nuggety Alliance Company was formed and took up a lease over most of the area. The Speculation and New Enterprise also worked the reef, and later the Old Nuggety Syndicate. Total historical production from Nuggety Reef was 301,000 ounces of gold from an estimated 50,000 tonne of ore, making it one of the highest grade reefs in Australia's history, at an incredible average of 187 grams to the tonne. But the profits could certainly have been higher. Hindsight is a lovely thing, and it was noted in the late 1860s by field geologist George Ulrich that the surface workings on Nuggety Reef presented a glaring instance of misspent labour and capital. There was an early resistance to large-scale cooperation throughout the entire goldfields, and as is the case here, areas which could have been worked cooperatively with far greater efficiency and profit were instead worked by many individual parties in a highly wasteful manner. At least a dozen expensive shafts were put down along Nuggety Reef, where one would probably have sufficed. This inefficient aversion to large-scale cooperation is the same interesting story we see right across the early goldfields of Victoria. And yet, enormous fortunes were made on the Nuggety Reef. Much of this was won close to the surface in the early years, but it wasn't always so easy going. As the mines got deeper, the difficulties increased. In the early days, miners could get away with working the reefs with a windlass and then a whim to bail water and raise ore. But once they reached a depth of a few hundred feet, even the whim became very inefficient. As the workings got deeper, the proper development of a quartz mining industry at Maldon was being greatly restricted by the persistent flooding of shafts. An upgrade to steam-powered winding and pumping machinery became essential. This required capital, and lots of it, and by the late 1850s, quartz mining companies with outside investment were being formed to replace the small syndicates. Draining the reefs was no easy undertaking. There were a number of private pumping companies formed which claimed to be able to dewater the mines in exchange for a share in any gold obtained below the original water level. These companies quickly discovered that their pumping machinery was inadequate for the task, having greatly underestimated the amount of water involved. But things started to look up when the Great Eastern Company was formed in 1857 with the intention of draining the Eagle Hawk Reef. This was a joint venture between a dozen miners on the reef and an investor from Melbourne, who provided the capital for both pumping and crushing machinery. The Great Eastern installed their substantial steam engine, commenced pumping and started crushing for the public, and was, at first, a very successful venture. Unfortunately, the whole operation would soon come to an end, as capital ran out before any serious amount of gold was produced. But that certainly wasn't the end of that. Over on the Beehive Reef, a number of claim holders got together and formed the Beehive Mining Association in 1859. They purchased the plant of the failed Great Eastern Company, including the engine, which was by far the largest on Tarrengower and was said to be the largest in the entire goldfields. The Beehive Mining Association had a very competent manager, mining engineer Henry Tregasky, whose experience and skill was applied in the development of the mine. Tregasky introduced a split shaft with 2 compartments, one for ore and equipment and the other for pumping and for miners. This was much safer than a simple undivided shaft, and was certainly the way forward for mine development in Victoria, with 2, 3 or 4 compartments becoming standard. More and more parties joined together to form companies, and with the raising of capital and the introduction and upgrading of machinery, a stable quartz mining industry was slowly but surely being established at Maldon. But it certainly wasn't without incident. In the mid-1860s, there was a dramatic dispute between the Great Western and Alpha companies, known as the notorious Maldon double banking case, where the Great Western wrongfully and knowingly mined stone from the Alpha's ground. The dispute went through the courts with much controversy and was finally brought before Judge Molesworth, the chief judge of the Court of Mines, who rightly ruled in favour of the Alpha Company. The news was delivered to the people of Maldon in a most theatrical fashion. Placards were displayed which read "Villainy vanquished, virtue rewarded, and wreck of the Great Western," while the Maldon band paraded through the town playing lively airs, and the happy proprietors of the victorious Alpha Company kept almost open house in every hotel in town. These celebrations were kept up until midnight. So there were a few hiccups here and there, but overall things were moving forward, very slowly. The groundwater was being dealt with by powerful steam engines, but water was not the only difficulty at Maldon. The rock they were sinking and tunnelling through was very hard, and at that time miners were working with hammer and tap drills, where one man held a long iron drill while one or two men smashed it into the rock with heavy hammers. This work was extremely slow, and the hardness of the rock at Maldon made it even more difficult. So when one company devised a plan to drive a tunnel right through the mountain, it is no surprise that they were looking for better solutions. And this led to the very early introduction of the first pneumatic rock drill ever used in Australia, right here at Maldon. The Mount Tarrangower Tunnelling Company was formed in 1865 to intersect a number of reefs underground. The company's mining engineer Mark Gardner suggested the use of a rock drill to speed up operations. The company sent him to Europe to inspect the drill to see if it would be suitable for the work at Maldon. Many miners here objected to the introduction of the machine, taking great pride in their hammer and tap skills. There was even an anonymous threat to destroy the drill, but the company paid no heed to the protests. They imported a low rock drill in 1867, and when the Mount Tarrangower Tunnelling Company put the machine to work, they were drilling at a rate of 2 inches per minute in the hard rock, a huge improvement to their previous rate of about 5 feet per week. Although they had the right idea with the pneumatic rock drill, they had difficulties with the repair and maintenance of the machine. The Mount Tarrangower Tunnelling Company never found payable gold, and they wound up after a few short years. Although this early experiment in rock drilling machinery was not a success, it certainly shows us the innovative spirit of the Maldon Goldfield. It was another 10 years before the pneumatic rock drills came into widespread use, and when they did, it totally revolutionised the mining industry. This goldfield was filled with innovators, which brings us back to the North British mine and its owner, Robert Oswald, the quartz king of Maldon. Oswald came to Maldon in the early 1860s and worked a claim on Parkins Reef. He also had a partnership with a local storekeeper with the Caledonian Battery, later buying out his partner's share. The profits from this crushing operation allowed Oswald to acquire a lease over a rich section of Parkins Reef. While this mine did moderately well through the late 1860s, the yields were not high enough to pay dividends and production stopped. Oswald applied for a lease on the same ground in his own name in 1871, and he established the North British Quartz Mining and Crushing Company, and the mine was worked by tribute companies through the 1870s. Fortunately for Oswald, as the workings got deeper, the yields increased and profits began pouring in. Oswald was a clever businessman and consistently reinvested large portions of his profits back into his mining operations. He invested in prospecting and mine development, continually upgraded his mining plant and processes, and introduced improved technologies wherever practical. His enterprising nature paid off. Oswald soon became one of the wealthiest men in Victoria, held large interest in nearly all the mining companies at Maldon, and remained the sole owner of the North British and independent mines until his death in 1891. As well as the impressive mining operations at this site, the North British had its own engineering shop, where an innovative, improved version of the popular National Rock Drill was manufactured. And to learn more about this, let's head over to the brilliant Maldon Vintage Machinery and Museum. This rock drill was manufactured using a crucible steel castings process, which made it possible to produce the drill locally without having to depend on foundries. Oswald's drills were used throughout Australia, and in the late 19th century they were being used by nearly all the large companies at Maldon. The drill remained a popular machine for decades and continued to be manufactured by Oswald's estate long after he passed away. In 1899, it was reported that the foundry at Oswald's North British mine was in full work, and that there was a constant demand for Oswald's improved national rock drill from all parts of Victoria, as well as the neighbouring colonies. When the drill was trialled at Stawell's Sloane's and Scotchman's mine in 1918, it was reported that it did the work in 2 shifts that other machines did in 5 or 6. As impressive as it was, the North British was not the biggest success story on the Maldon Goldfield. There was one mine which exceeded the North British both in depth and riches, and that was the remarkable South German Company. The South German was the deepest mine on the Maldon Goldfield, having reached a depth of 2,200 feet. And for several years in the 1890s, it stood proudly among the richest producing quartz gold mines in Victoria. The great success of the South German Company was largely due to the innovative enterprise of its chairman of directors, Scottish engineer Mr. William Blair Gray. Gray kept up to date with the latest inventions and innovations regarding gold-saving appliances and took great care selecting the best technologies for the South German plant. In 1892, the South German was reported by James Cosmo Newbery himself to have the most efficient concentrating plant in the colony. Gray took his job very seriously. He was described as watching the tailings of the South German mine settle in their final heap with a regretful sigh, and watching the water from operations flow away to the creek with envious eyes. He was of the opinion that a great fortune awaited the man who could discover a simple means of arresting the minute particles of gold which evaded all the traps which even he had set to catch them. The recovery of fine gold locked up in pyrites had always been a particular problem for the mining companies at Maldon, and while the blanket sands were being saved at the South German mine, the companies scarcely knew what to do with them. They were sold off at 30 shillings a tonne, and they were simply washed for poor returns. This was incredibly wasteful, and Gray was keen to find a solution. He took an interest in the chlorination process, and in the early 1890s sent 6 tonnes of crushed ore to Edwards' chlorination plant at Bendigo. There was a significant amount of gold recovered using this method. Gray conducted further tests and inspected the chlorination plants at Ballarat and Daylesford. He soon determined that this effective process was the way forward for the South German mine. While there were already experiments in chlorination taking place at the Oswald mines, the South German was the first company at Maldon to install a large-scale chlorination plant. This was based off the plant which was in use at the Mount Morgan mine in Queensland, which Gray went to view for himself, and the company even hired H.A. Morgan, the engineer at Mount Morgan, to supervise the construction of the plant. The South German's new chlorination plant was the best of its kind in Victoria, and here's how it all worked. When the battery sands passed the quicksilver wells and copper plates, they were then passed over Halley's percussion table, which saved the coarser pyrites. These concentrates were previously calcined or roasted, then amalgamated in a Chilean mill, but Gray had deemed this process to be inefficient. A Duncan concentrator was also employed, which saved a good percentage of pyrites from the blanket sands. The heavy concentrates having been saved, the tailings were then conveyed by a pump into a Spitzkasten, a huge inverted pyramid, which classified them, separating the very fine slimes from the coarser material. The fine slimes, which made up 2/3 of the material, were collected in settling tanks before being sent to 3 Triumph vanners, a type of concentrating table. The remaining 1/3 of the material, which was coarser, was passed on to 7 vanners. This classification is likely what caused James Cosmo Newbery to designate the South German as the most efficient concentrating plant, as many mines were running material of widely varying specific gravities over their vanners all at once, rendering the machines fairly inefficient. Henry Rosales noted in his 1895 report on the loss of gold in the reduction of ores that the South German plant was the first attempt he had seen on a large and practical scale at classification of the material before sending it to concentrating tables, and that it was certainly a step in advance. Even after all this, Gray was still not prepared to let the tailings go. All the water from the vanners and the settling pits was passed into a wooden flume, which carried it out into a paddock where it was divided and passed down a gentle slope over 80 feet of coarse canvas, stretched at the bottom of shallow races. Twice a day, the slime which was caught in the canvas was washed off into tubs using brushes. The concentrates from the Halley tables, Duncan concentrators, vanners and canvas racers were all mixed together, then elevated into a mechanical furnace for roasting. The roasted material was then treated by chlorination. The South German used the Hall and Richards chlorination process, which was used at the Mount Morgan mine. Open vats were used rather than closed revolving barrels, and the chlorine liquid was passed through the material in the vat using an ingenious arrangement of pumps, leaching the gold out of the material. The chlorine liquid, charged with gold, was then passed through a series of charcoal filters, where the gold was precipitated onto the charcoal. This was a monumental step up from selling all the blanketings for a pittance, and the company proposed to increase the capacity of the plant by a further 50% by putting in an additional 10 head of stamps and 5 more Triumph vanners, which they did, but it still wasn't perfect, and Gray knew it. While inspecting the Mount Morgan chlorination plant, he had viewed another interesting experiment, the cyanide process. In this process, gold was dissolved from crushed ore using a cyanide solution, then precipitated using zinc shavings. Gray sent some of the South German tailings for testing at a small cyanide plant at Pegleg, and he was so satisfied with the results that he proposed the construction of a large-scale, sophisticated cyanide plant at the South German mine. This plant was completed in 1896 and was one of the first of its kind in Australia. The South German was yet again considered as having the most up-to-date plant in the colony. Field geologist R.A. Moon had previously visited Maldon and made detailed plans of various mines, and he made a special return visit to include a plan of the South German's impressive new cyanide plant. How fortunate are we to have this detailed snapshot of the company's gold-saving operations. So let's take a closer look. The ore is first delivered to the stamp batteries, where it is crushed, then passed over copper plates coated with mercury, which catches the gold by amalgamation. The crushed ore is then run over Halley's percussion tables, which catch and concentrate heavy material, then blanket tables, which catch more. The blanket sands are then treated in Duncan concentrators. The tailings are then conveyed through a covered conduit to a sand pit, from which it is pumped through a sand pipe to the Spitzkasten, which classifies the sand by size. The very fine slimes are sent to the slimes tanks, where the finer quantities of sand and metal are saved by settling. The coarser portion of the sand is conveyed in an open semicircular channel to the large cyanide vats, where it was treated with successive solutions of cyanide until as much gold as possible was removed. The gold-rich solution is then reticulated over a series of charcoal filters. The overflow slimes from the cyanide vats are conveyed through another open channel to the slimes tanks for settling. These are then puddled in a little puddling machine, then passed over vanners to save the metal. The concentrates from the vanners are then brought to a drying bed, which is heated by the flue which passes under it from the roasting furnace and elevated to the platform above, whence it is shovelled onto the open hearth at the top of the furnace. A series of revolving rakes, actuated by the little furnace engine, keep up the necessary agitation to cause the sand to pass from each level to the next. When thoroughly roasted, the sulfur and arsenic being separated from the ores, the sand is put through the chlorination process previously described. Once the charcoal from both the cyanide and chlorination processes was sufficiently charged with gold, it was then removed to the charcoal furnaces where it was reduced to ash. The ash, with appropriate fluxes added, is finally smelted in the smelting furnace, with gold of the highest quality thus being obtained. Another interesting note is that the South German plant was using charcoal instead of zinc for precipitation, an important innovation which presented several advantages, the main one being a better quality of gold produced. The president of the Institution of Mining and Metallurgy inspected the South German mine on a visit to Australia and presented a paper describing the works at the institution's second ordinary meeting in 1897. Great attention was given to the use of wood charcoal for precipitation because while its application in the chlorination process was well known, its use in cyanidation appeared entirely novel, and there were many questions asked at the meeting. Gray himself wrote a paper on the treatment of slimes at the South German plant for the Australasian Institute of Mining Engineers, which was published in 1898, where he discussed the merits of using charcoal rather than zinc for precipitation, as well as another very important addition to the cyanide plant, which he adopted and incorporated very soon after the plant's construction. One of the great early setbacks with the cyanide process was the difficulty in getting the cyanide solution to properly percolate through fine slimes. A solution was found at Bendigo with an ingenious invention by a Mr. Joel Diebel. Diebel's machine used an agitator to thoroughly churn up the slime so that every particle of gold could be brought into contact with the cyanide solution. Gray's paper described these machines as agitation vats, 18 feet in diameter and 4 feet deep. Solution was added to the vat, the agitator was set in motion, and the slimes were tipped truck by truck into the vat until it contained 15 tons. The proper quantity of cyanide was then put into the vat to bring it up to the appropriate strength, and the agitation continued for at least 30 hours. The agitator is then stopped and screwed up out of the body of the slime, which is allowed to settle over 8 to 16 hours. The liquor above is cleared and decanted off gradually and is passed through the charcoal filters for precipitation. This was yet another revolutionary development, and the South German company purchased the right to use this agitating machine for £500. With the new cyanide plant in full operation and the improved machinery and processes added in, the South German company now had one of the finest gold recovery plants in the Southern Hemisphere. And Gray still wasn't finished. He would later add more cyanide vats and other improvements over several stages. The operation was such a success that it drew the attention of mine managers, engineers, and interested onlookers from far and wide. And Wednesday was appointed as the day when curious visitors could inspect the works. This plant's incredible success prompted other mining companies to confidently embrace the cyanide process. The South German was still being described as one of the best in 1901 when Donald Clark, director of the Bairnsdale School of Mines, wrote a detailed article about it for the Australian Mining Standard. He stated that charcoal precipitation in cyanide treatment had become widely adopted in Victoria, although it was still largely unknown elsewhere. It appears that Gray's early advocacy for the use of charcoal was quite justified, giving us yet another example of his innovative nature and the influence his work had. Clark's article also included a diagrammatic plan of the plant, showing that by this time the Duncan concentrators had been swapped out for a Wilfley table to concentrate the blanket sands. Maldon was truly at the forefront of mining innovation. The South German company ranked as one of Victoria's leading gold producers, and its ongoing underground development was facilitated by the increased profits from their extremely efficient mill. Introducing the revolutionary cyanide process on a grand scale was not the only important contribution Gray and the South German company made to the advancement of the quartz mining industry in Victoria. They were also heavily involved in making this process more accessible throughout the colony. The developers of the MacArthur Forest cyanide process required a royalty of 10% to be paid on all gold recovered using their process. When they attempted to widen their patent claim in Australia to include more recent variations on the process, William Gray, backed by the South German Company, challenged the proposal in court. With a number of mining companies threatened by a wave of patent infringement lawsuits, Victoria's young cyaniding industry was on the verge of total paralysis. Gray was not deterred and escalated the issue all the way to the Privy Council in London. He did not abandon his efforts until the Victorian government resolved the issue by purchasing the rights to the process, reducing the royalty from 10% to 2.5%, a temporary fee to recoup the cost of the acquisition. What a monumental impact William Gray and the South German Company had on the quartz mining industry in Victoria. But all good things must come to an end, and although the South German Company was still in good ground, they had persistent issues with flooding, and the company was wound up in 1918. As the early 20th century went on, the mines were closing one by one, and when the Oswald estate mines were wound up in 1926, a great era at Maldon had come to an end. Historical production from reef mining at Maldon is estimated at about 1.75 million ounces at an average grade of 28 grams to the tonne. But that wasn't the end of the story for Maldon. Small operations continued throughout the rest of the 20th century, and the late 20th and early 21st centuries saw a revival in Maldon's mining and gold processing industries, and it's certainly not over yet. This modern gold processing plant is situated at Porcupine Flat, just outside Maldon. Originally built in the late 1980s, this plant has been refined and updated by mining company Kaiser Reef to maximise gold recovery. And this is what it's all about.
Welcome to the Porcupine Flat Gold Processing Plant, a key part of Kaiser Reef's operations. The ore that we process here comes from the historic A1 mine near Gaffney's Creek, which has been in operation since the 1860s.
Every day, 3 or 4 25-tonne trucks deliver ore to this processing plant in Maldon, and it comes all the way from Kaiser Reef's A1 mine near Gaffney's Creek. The A1 mine began operations on Castle Reef way back in the 1860s and is one of Australia's longest-running gold mines. It was named the A1 because of the high quality of the gold it produced. Just like the South German Company, Kaiser Reef uses a combination of gravity separation and chemical treatment, but with gold recovery rates up to 97%. So how do they do it? Well, let's take a closer look at this modern-day gold processing plant. When the trucks arrive, they go over a weighbridge on their way in, then bring the ore up to the ROM pad, which has a storage capacity of 1,000 tonnes. The first step is to crush the ore to a smaller size, and this is done using a jaw crusher. The crushing circuit consists of a 50-tonne ore bin, plate feeder, shaker screen, and a 42-inch Terex jaw crusher, which reduces the ore to 75mm. This jaw crusher is named Lizzie in honour of Queen Elizabeth II, as it was commissioned the day Britain's longest reigning monarch passed away. A conveyor belt stacks the crushed and undersized screened material onto the crushed ore stockpile, which has a capacity of about 10,000 tonnes. Here the ore can be blended before entering the comminution circuit, where the ore is ground finely for further treatment. And this is where things start to get really interesting. This conveyor belt weighs the ore before delivering it to the SAG mill, which uses steel balls to grind the ore down to 75 microns. A trommel is used for classifying, and any ore which hasn't been reduced far enough is retained and put back through the mill for further grinding. The next step is gravity recovery, where the coarse gold and other minerals are recovered using a concentrator. These concentrates are sent directly to the gold room, where a shaker table is used for final separation. The gravity circuit is particularly effective for A1 ore, which contains a significant amount of coarse gold. But what about the gold which can't be recovered using gravity? Well, this is where the chemical processing comes in. It's crucial that the ore is properly ground for effective treatment. So before it leaves the comminution circuit, it's classified in these cyclones, which use centrifugal force to separate particles by size. The finest material overflows from the top of the cyclone and is directed to the next stage of processing, while the coarser material stays and is directed back to the SAG mill to be ground further. This ensures that every particle leaving the comminution circuit is of optimal size for the next stage of processing. So the very fine material which overflowed from the cyclones is now ready for cyanide treatment. Kaiser Reef has a 6-stage circuit. This consists of 1 leach tank and 5 carbon in pulp tanks, which uses cyanide to dissolve the gold and carbon to adsorb it.
You wouldn't think to look at it, but this carbon is loaded full of gold. We've taken this and put the gold onto this.
Lime is added to the circuit to maintain a pH above 10, which keeps the cyanide stable. And gas monitors are located on the leach deck, mill room entrances, and on all personnel working around the plant. Leaching takes place in an agitated tank, with air added from a compressor to assist the process. Here, the gold is transformed from a solid to a liquid, a gold cyanide solution. In the next 5 tanks, activated carbon is mixed with the pulp, and the gold cyanide complex is adsorbed onto the surface and pores of the carbon. The gold-rich carbon is put into an elution column, which uses a high-temperature caustic cyanide solution and hot water in a pressure vessel. This is designed to reverse the adsorption and release the gold cyanide complex, producing a gold-rich solution or eluate. The stripped carbon is regenerated in a kiln to reactivate the surface and pores, then returned to the circuit to do the same job all over again. The whole process is carefully monitored and controlled by this intricate mill control system, which is currently the most to standard system in any mine in Australia. Finally, the rich eluate is pumped through an electrowinning cell. An electric current is passed through the solution, causing the gold to plate out onto a series of stainless steel mesh cathodes. This is then washed off and filtered. What's left is a stack of this very strange looking mud, which is extremely rich in gold. It is now ready to be smelted, and this, without a doubt, is the most exciting stage of the whole operation. This gold has been on quite a journey to get to this stage. While Kaiser Reef is currently trucking all their ore from the A1 mine over 300 kilometres away, they have big plans in the works. Soon they'll also be processing ore from somewhere much closer. This is Maldon's Union Hill mine, which has been worked from the 1850s, first using vertical shafts, then an open cut, and most recently a modern decline. Kaiser Reef holds a fully permitted mining license for this site and has recently completed a mining study with plans to bring Union Hill out of care and maintenance. The goal is to recommence exploration and bring the mine back into production, continuing the town's proud history of underground mining. The mining license encompasses most of the main producing reefs of the Maldon Goldfield, which since the 1850s have yielded 1.75 million ounces of gold at an average of 28 grams to the tonne. This includes the fabulously rich Nuggety Reef, which produced 301,000 ounces of gold at a phenomenal grade of 187 grams to the tonne. And the South German mine, which was abandoned in the early 20th century after flooding, while still in very rich ground. The high-grade mineralisation at Maldon remains largely untapped, presenting exciting potential for the future. Kaiser Reef plans to establish a second decline drive parallel to the existing decline and aim to access the Union Chute in the Eaglehawk Reef, the Alliance Chute, and the Alliance South Lode. Modern access using a large decline greatly enhances underground operations, offering improved efficiency and better access to extensive areas compared to historical methods. These historical mines all used vertical shafts for underground access, and while both methods involved bringing ore up one truck at a time, the trucks have gone from this to this. Just one example of the many great advancements we've seen in the mining industry since the gold rush era. Victoria's rich gold mining history has left us with a unique and fascinating cultural landscape, forming an integral part of our heritage today. While mining operations of the past significantly altered the land, today's mining industry places a strong focus on minimising environmental impact and incorporates sustainable practices at every stage of operations.
Gold processing has come a long way since the gold rush era. Today we use cutting-edge 21st century technology to maximise gold recovery while prioritising sustainability, supporting the community and minimising our environmental impact.
Here at Maldon, all water is held and reused. Tailings are safely stored on site and everything is carefully monitored through regular tests and inspections. Specially designed dams store the crushed ore or tailings after the gold has been recovered. The water is removed from the tailings to another dam to be used again in the processing plant, and the cyanide left in the tailings degrades naturally over time. Once the tailings dams are no longer in use, they are rehabilitated into a rich environment and thriving habitat, just as we see here. By optimising use of their existing space and following strict containment protocols, Kaiser Reef maintains a minimal operational footprint. As complex as the gold extraction process is, and despite the variety of materials and steps involved, remarkably, the only product that leaves this site is gold. Just as the environment is a top priority in modern-day gold mining, so too are the communities in which the mines operate. Community consideration is an integral part of every decision. Kaiser Reef is committed to keeping noise and dust to an absolute minimum. In their processing plant, the jaw crusher is equipped with a water, mist and vacuum system to ensure that no dust leaves the site, and they have noise suppression in place around all noise-producing components. Over at the Union Hill mine, their planned second decline will provide ventilation underground, reducing the need for ventilation machinery at the surface. Kaiser Reef also works with the local community, supporting volunteers and sponsoring events. They provide fresh water from the Union Hill mine to 35 local farmers. They've donated historical gold processing machinery to the brilliant Maldon Vintage Machinery and Museum, and they also work with the iconic Victorian Goldfields Railway, collaborating to reuse and recycle waste products, further reducing their environmental footprint. This beautiful town is a historic gem of the gold rush era, and it's on the verge of becoming a modern-day gold mining town once again. Kaiser Reef is continuing the rich legacy of the Maldon Goldfield, but with modern, forward-thinking techniques. They're maintaining a balance between progress and sustainability as they protect the environment and support the local community, helping to secure a prosperous future for the region. With operations recommencing in such a highly mineralised field, there's an exciting new chapter ahead in the fascinating story of the Maldon Goldfield.